Mrs. Evelyn Thomas walked slowly along the sidewalk, holding her small leather handbag close to her side. She wore a long, gray-colored dress, and over her shoulders was a light shawl to guard against the breeze. Her gray hair was tied neatly into a tidy bun. Every step she took showed calm and confidence, the kind that comes from years of experience. The sun hung low in the sky, casting soft shadows along the quiet neighborhood street. Birds chirped in the distance, and a few cars passed by without much noise. Mrs. Thomas turned the corner and came into view of a small, locally owned convenience store. It wasn't a place she often visited. She preferred larger grocery stores where she felt more welcome, but today her legs were tired, and this shop was the closest one. The faded sign above the door squeaked in the wind, and the glass door rattled slightly as she pushed it open. A small bell rang above her, letting the clerk know someone had entered. Inside, the store was quiet. Only one other shopper walked through the aisles. Behind the counter stood a young man wearing a dark gray shirt. His short brown hair was slightly messy, and he leaned on the counter as if he had no interest in being there. His face wore a permanent smirk, like he found something funny that no one else could see. He looked up for a moment as Mrs. Thomas entered, then quickly looked away, as if she didn't matter. She gave a polite nod in his direction and began walking through the aisles. She moved with care, picking up a small carton of milk and placing it gently into her basket. She then added a loaf of bread and a box of tea. Her fingers paused over a row of fruit. She carefully chose 3 apples and placed them beside her other items. As she made her way to the front of the store, the clerk watched her lazily. When she placed her items on the counter, he gave a small laugh and didn't hide his smug tone. "You sure that card's gonna work, ma'am?" he said with a smirk, tapping the counter twice. Mrs. Thomas looked at him quietly. She didn't show any sign of being upset. Instead, she opened her handbag, took out her credit card, and handed it to him with steady hands. He took the card with 2 fingers, holding it like it was something odd. "Hope it's not one of those prepaid ones," he muttered with a chuckle. He swiped it slowly, making the moment last longer than it needed to. He clearly wanted others to hear what he was saying. The machine beeped. The payment had gone through without a problem. Mrs. Thomas took her bag of groceries, nodded once, and walked out calmly. She didn't say a word. Outside, the wind picked up gently as she made her way down the sidewalk once again. Mrs. Evelyn Thomas walked slowly down the sidewalk, her paper bag of groceries held firmly in one hand. The wind tugged gently at the edges of her shawl, but she kept moving forward without looking back. Her face stayed calm, but inside, a storm was quietly forming. Not from anger, but from something deeper, disappointment. She had lived in that town for over 50 years. She had seen it grow, change, and sometimes stay the same in the wrong ways. Today had reminded her of some old wounds she thought time had healed. But Mrs. Thomas was not someone who let pain sit without purpose. She believed in handling things with grace and with action. As she reached her small home at the end of the street, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was neat, filled with warm colors and old photographs. She placed her groceries on the kitchen counter and slowly took a seat at the round table near the window. The afternoon sun lit the room with a soft glow. Outside, a few children played down the street, laughing and chasing a ball. Mrs. Thomas watched them for a moment, then reached for the telephone on the table. She dialed a number from memory. It rang twice before a friendly voice answered. "Good afternoon, Evelyn," the voice said. "Hello, Martin," she replied kindly. "I need to talk business. Are you free to meet tomorrow?" Martin, her longtime friend and attorney, paused before responding. "Always for you. Is everything all right?" "It will be," Mrs. Thomas said softly. The next morning, the town was still quiet when Mrs. Thomas and Martin met at his office. The building was small but tidy, filled with the smell of coffee and old books. She explained everything that had happened at the store. Martin listened closely, his expression serious. After she finished, he looked across the table and said, "You want to buy the store, don't you?" Mrs. Thomas nodded. "Yes. Not out of pride, not to punish, but because that store serves this community, and it should do so with fairness and respect." Papers were drawn up. Calls were made. The current owner, an older man who had moved out of state months ago, was more than willing to sell. He didn't visit the store often and didn't know much about how it was being run. All he saw was a chance to step away cleanly. Within 48 hours, the deal was signed. Mrs. Thomas, now the new owner, sat quietly with the final documents in front of her. She didn't smile or celebrate. Instead, she simply closed the folder and whispered, "Now, let's fix what's broken." She stood up, adjusted her shawl, and walked toward the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, stronger than the day before, but she walked through it with the same steady grace she always carried. 2 days after signing the papers, Mrs. Evelyn Thomas stood in front of the small store once again, this time with a different purpose. The "Under New Ownership" sign had been placed above the door, bright and clear for all to see. It was early in the morning, and the store hadn't yet opened for the day. As she approached, she could hear movement from inside. The clerk from the other day, the one who had laughed at her, was inside, wiping down the counter. He didn't seem to notice her approach until she was almost at the door. When the bell above the door jingled, the young man looked up, a look of surprise crossing his face. His casual stance quickly stiffened. He had not expected to see her again, especially not so soon. "You're back," he said, his voice sounding unsure. "Good morning," Mrs. Thomas replied politely, walking into the store. She glanced around, taking in the familiar shelves, now filled with the same old goods. It looked the same, yet everything felt different. It was hers now. She walked past the aisles, slowly taking in the small details. The store had the same smell of old wood and cleaning supplies, but there was something else now too, a sense of change, a quiet promise that things would be different. "You must be surprised to see me," she said as she turned to face the clerk. He nodded, his eyes avoiding hers. The smirk he had worn just days before was gone, replaced by a nervous tension. "I wasn't expecting," he began, his voice trailing off. It was clear that he didn't know what to say next. "I'm not here to make trouble," Mrs. Thomas said, her tone calm but firm. "I'm here to talk." She paused for a moment, letting the words settle. She could see his discomfort, but she wasn't there to scold him. She simply wanted to make sure he understood. She needed him to hear her words to learn. "You will stay on staff," she continued, "but things are going to change. Starting today, you will be undergoing customer service training, and you will also volunteer at the local community center every week. You'll be learning more about the people who live here, the people who walk through this store." The young man didn't speak at first. His eyes widened as he processed what she was saying. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes, Mom," he said quietly. "I understand." Mrs. Thomas studied him for a moment, noting the change in his posture. She had seen enough in him to believe that he could learn. Sometimes, people just needed a nudge in the right direction, but it was up to him to follow through. "Good," she said, her voice warm but steady. "I believe in second chances, but I also believe in accountability. I'm giving you that chance, but you'll have to show that you're willing to grow." She walked toward the counter, where the register sat, and smiled slightly. "This store belongs to this community. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. That includes you, and it includes everyone who walks through that door." The clerk remained silent, but the look in his eyes told her that he understood. Mrs. Thomas turned toward the door, ready to leave, but before she stepped out, she paused, one hand on the door handle. She looked back at him and said, "Remember, kindness costs nothing, and it's never too late to start." With that, she stepped outside, letting the door close softly behind her. The store was hers now, and the change she sought had only just begun. Over the next few days, Mrs. Evelyn Thomas made her presence known in the small store, but she did so quietly. She wasn't there to show off her new position. Instead, she observed, she wanted to understand how things worked, how the customers were treated, and how the store operated under the clerk's watch. The young man, still somewhat nervous, seemed to be trying his best. He was on time every morning, and although he didn't speak much to the customers, he did his job. He no longer wore the smug expression he had shown Mrs. Thomas on that first day. Instead, his face was more focused, as if he was always thinking about his next step. Mrs. Thomas would come in during the late mornings, sometimes staying for hours, just watching. She often greeted the regular customers with a soft smile and a few kind words. The customers, some of whom had known her for years, greeted her back warmly, surprised to see the new owner taking the time to speak with them. The store, though still the same, started to feel different. There was a quiet shift in the air. People felt more comfortable. It wasn't just about the products on the shelves. It was about the way they were treated. One afternoon, an elderly man came into the store. He was a regular, known by most of the neighbors. He shuffled to the counter with a small basket of groceries. When he set them down, the young clerk scanned them without a word. The man looked up at him and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "How's your day been?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. The clerk, looking surprised, looked up from the register. It was clear that no one had ever asked him that before. After a long pause, he gave a small nod. "Good," he said, his voice sounding unsure. Then he seemed to soften, almost imperceptibly. After the man left, Mrs. Thomas, who had been watching from the back of the store, walked over to the counter. The clerk was wiping his hands on his shirt, looking lost in thought. "How did it feel?" she asked him gently. He looked up at her, his expression uncertain. "It was different," he admitted. "I didn't know what to say, but it felt good. Talking to him like that." "It's a start," Mrs. Thomas replied with a smile. "Small steps lead to big changes." Over the next few weeks, the clerk continued to grow more comfortable with the customers. He began to ask more questions, engage in small talk, and even made an effort to remember names. Though he wasn't perfect, he was trying, and Mrs. Thomas could see the change happening. One day, a regular customer, a middle-aged woman who often came in with her children, walked up to the counter. The clerk greeted her with a genuine smile, and they exchanged a few words. As the woman left with her groceries, she turned back toward him. "You've been doing a great job," she said with a warm smile. "It's good to see you trying." The clerk's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected that kind of praise. He nodded, a shy smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. As Mrs. Thomas stood in the background, watching the exchange, she couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. The work was slow, but it was paying off. Things were changing, bit by bit, and it was all happening because people were beginning to treat each other with more kindness and respect. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And for Mrs. Thomas, that was enough for now. Weeks passed, and the small store seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Mrs. Evelyn Thomas continued her quiet presence, making sure everything ran smoothly. The young clerk, now a bit more confident, had become a familiar face to the regulars. Though he wasn't yet a model employee, his transformation was noticeable. He smiled more often, and his interactions with the customers were becoming warmer. One rainy afternoon, the store was quieter than usual. Mrs. Thomas stood by the window, watching the rain hit the glass. The sound of the droplets against the window was calming, and for a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself be lost in the peaceful rhythm. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled. She turned to see a woman and her young daughter enter the store, both of them shaking the rain from their coats. The young clerk immediately greeted them, his voice polite but unsure. Mrs. Thomas watched closely from the back of the store, noticing how the clerk seemed a little more relaxed when speaking to them. The woman, with a tired but friendly smile, approached the counter. "It's such a gloomy day," she said as she placed a few items on the counter. The clerk nodded in agreement and rang up her groceries. As the transaction continued, Mrs. Thomas couldn't help but overhear their conversation. The woman spoke about the weather, how she had been struggling with some family matters, and how hard it was to get out in the rain with her young daughter. The clerk listened patiently, nodding and offering small words of comfort. As the woman finished paying, she turned to the clerk with a kind smile. "Thank you for being so patient with us," she said. The young man paused, looking at her for a moment before offering a small, genuine smile. "It's no problem. I'm glad I could help." The woman seemed surprised by his response. Her smile grew wider. "It's good to see you trying," she said softly, before gathering her things and heading toward the door. As they left, Mrs. Thomas moved slowly toward the counter. The young clerk looked down at the register, a thoughtful look on his face. "You're doing well," she said gently. The clerk looked up at her, surprised. "You think so?" "Yes," she replied with a small smile. "You're learning. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up and trying. That's what matters." He nodded, looking more at ease than he had in the past. "Thanks. It feels different, talking to people like that." "That's because it is," Mrs. Thomas said, her tone kind but firm. "You're beginning to see the people behind the transactions. They're not just customers. They're neighbors, friends, and part of this community." The young man smiled again, a little more confidently this time. "I'll keep working on it." Mrs. Thomas nodded, her heart warmed by his words. She had seen change in him, and though it wasn't instant, it was real. The work wasn't finished, but it was heading in the right direction. As she left the store that afternoon, Mrs. Thomas looked up at the sky, still cloudy, but with a hint of light trying to break through. Just like the store, the town was changing, and she was helping to make that happen, one step at a time. A month had passed since Mrs. Evelyn Thomas had taken ownership of the small store. The changes had been gradual, but they were becoming clear. The young clerk, now more accustomed to his role, had started to understand the value of kindness. He still had moments where he wasn't sure of himself, but he was doing better than he ever had before. One morning, Mrs. Thomas arrived early, as she often did. She had become part of the rhythm of the store, blending into the background as she watched things unfold. The shop was quiet at this hour, with only a few customers drifting in to pick up their morning newspapers and coffee. She stood near the counter, observing the young clerk as he rang up a customer's items. A man in his mid-40s, a regular customer, stood at the counter, exchanging small talk with the clerk. Mrs. Thomas watched as the two of them laughed over something trivial, the air light and easy. It was a small moment, but it mattered. She could see that the young man had begun to trust himself a little more, and the customers were starting to see him differently. After the man left, the clerk looked up at Mrs. Thomas, a hesitant smile on his face. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to talk to customers like that," he said. His voice was still uncertain, but there was a hint of pride in it. "You're doing well," Mrs. Thomas replied kindly. "You're learning to connect with them. It's about listening, not just talking." He nodded slowly, clearly thinking about her words. Before he could speak again, the bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of another customer. This time, it was a woman with two young children, both of them tugging at their mother's coat. The clerk greeted them as usual, but Mrs. Thomas could see the difference. The clerk asked the children about their day, showing interest in them beyond the usual transaction. The woman smiled, clearly pleased with the warmth in his voice. As the family left, the clerk turned to Mrs. Thomas with a more confident expression. "It feels different now," he said. "I don't know what changed, but I'm starting to enjoy it." "That's good," Mrs. Thomas said, her smile gentle. "When you learn to enjoy the work, it stops feeling like a job. It becomes part of who you are." The clerk nodded, his shoulders less stiff than before. There was a quiet sense of pride in him now. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about growing. He was starting to see the bigger picture. As the day wore on, the store became busier. Mrs. Thomas continued her usual routine, helping out when needed, but mostly observing. She noticed how the clerk was handling things with more ease, how he was becoming more comfortable in his role. By late afternoon, the store was nearly full, with customers coming and going. The young clerk handled it all without hesitation. There were a few minor hiccups, but he managed them well, asking for help when he needed it, and learning from his mistakes. Mrs. Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction as she watched him. The change she had hoped for was happening, slowly but surely. It wasn't just about improving the store. It was about creating a space where kindness and respect were at the heart of everything. And she could see that now. More than ever, her vision was coming to life. As the sun began to set, casting a soft golden light over the store, Mrs. Thomas walked toward the door, ready to leave for the day. She turned back to the clerk, who was now helping a new customer. "You're doing just fine," she said, her voice warm. He looked up, giving her a small smile, and for the first time, she saw the confidence in his eyes. The weeks continued to pass, and Mrs. Evelyn Thomas found herself more and more connected to the small store she had taken over. It had become a place of comfort and routine, not just for her, but for the community. People came in, exchanged pleasantries, and left feeling a little lighter than before. The changes were small, but they added up over time. The young clerk, once unsure and distant, had grown into a more capable and thoughtful individual. Though he still had moments of doubt, his progress was clear to anyone who watched. He had learned the importance of listening, of truly seeing the people who walked through the door, not just as customers, but as individuals with lives and stories. One morning, as Mrs. Thomas arrived at the store, she noticed something different. The young clerk was standing behind the counter, talking to a new customer. But this time, there was no hesitation in his voice. He was relaxed, confident, and engaging with the customer like they were old friends. It was a moment that made Mrs. Thomas pause for a moment, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. The customer, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, was laughing at something the clerk had said. Mrs. Thomas could hear snippets of their conversation as she walked toward the back of the store. It was light, easy, and comfortable. The clerk seemed at ease, no longer stiff or unsure. The woman's smile was genuine, and she seemed grateful for the kindness in his voice. As the transaction ended, the woman turned to leave. Before stepping out, she paused and looked back at the clerk. "Thank you for making my day a little brighter," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. The clerk's smile grew wider, and he nodded. "You're welcome," he said simply. Mrs. Thomas watched from a distance, her heart warmed by the exchange. It was a small moment, but it meant so much. The clerk had come a long way since that first encounter, and she knew that he had learned something important. Kindness mattered. Making connections mattered. It wasn't about impressing people, it was about showing them respect. As the day went on, the store became busier. Customers came in and out, and the young clerk handled it all with ease. He greeted each person with a smile, asked about their day, and made small talk that made them feel seen. It was the kind of service that felt genuine, not forced. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Mrs. Thomas continued her usual routine, but now she felt a sense of pride watching him. She didn't need to hover over him anymore. He had found his rhythm, and he was doing well on his own. By the afternoon, the store had quieted down. The young clerk was taking a short break, sitting at the back of the store with a cup of coffee. Mrs. Thomas walked over to him, offering a small smile. "How do you feel about all this?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. He looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. "It feels good. I'm not perfect, but I feel like I'm getting better every day." "You are," Mrs. Thomas said, her voice warm. "And that's what matters." The young man smiled, his eyes shining with a quiet pride. He had learned something valuable over the past few weeks, and it was clear that he was starting to understand what it meant to truly care for others. As the days turned into weeks, the store began to feel more like a home than just a place of business. Mrs. Evelyn Thomas had watched the transformation unfold, not only in the store, but also in the young clerk. His journey wasn't just about learning how to handle transactions. It was about growing as a person, understanding the importance of empathy, and treating others with kindness. One particular afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the store was unusually quiet. The bell above the door rang softly as a few customers came in for their evening shopping. Mrs. Thomas stood near the back, observing as the clerk moved through his tasks with a calm and focused energy. He was no longer the unsure young man who had started weeks ago. He had grown into someone who took pride in his work and understood that every customer who walked through the door was an opportunity to make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. He wasn't perfect, but he was real, and that made all the difference. As the last customer of the day left, the young clerk turned to Mrs. Thomas with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady but curious, "about what you said, about making connections with people. It's not just about selling things. It's about making them feel good, right?" Mrs. Thomas smiled, proud of the progress he had made. "Yes," she said softly. "It's about understanding that every person is more than just a customer. They're someone with their own life, their own struggles, their own joys. When you take the time to acknowledge that, you make a real difference." He nodded, taking in her words. "I think I'm starting to get it. It's not always easy, but when I see someone smile or thank me for listening, it feels worth it." "That's the heart of it," she replied. "Sometimes, the smallest gestures have the biggest impact. And you've made a difference, whether you realize it or not." The young clerk smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I've learned more than I thought I would." "You've earned it," Mrs. Thomas said. "You've put in the work, and you've grown. That's what matters." The two of them stood there for a moment, sharing a quiet understanding. The store had changed in ways that went beyond the physical. It had become a space where people felt welcomed, where the atmosphere was warm, and where kindness was at the center of everything. Mrs. Thomas had known all along that it wasn't just about selling goods. It was about creating a place where people felt valued and respected. As the store's lights dimmed for the night, and Mrs. Thomas prepared to lock up, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The young clerk had come so far, and the store had become something more than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was a community. With a final look around, Mrs. Thomas smiled to herself. The journey had been challenging, but it had been worth it. She had witnessed the transformation of a young man, and in doing so, she had helped create a space where kindness and understanding would continue to grow. And as she locked the door for the night, she knew that the store was in good hands.